The neon lights above the entrance flickered like a tired heartbeat, faintly humming against the darkening Ohio sky. Owen's Diner had been there longer than most folks in Springfield could remember. The paint on the bricks was chipped, the windows smudged with fingerprints and years of dust, but the smell, that was the thing that brought people back. The aroma of sizzling bacon, fresh ground coffee brewing behind the counter, and burgers grilling over an open flame. It was the scent of comfort, of familiarity, the kind of place where you could expect the same folks to be sitting in the same booths every night. Except tonight wasn't quite the same. J.D. Vance pulled into the lot, his SUV crunching over gravel. He'd heard about this place earlier in the day. Some guy, a retiree who'd buttonholed him outside a community center, swore by their meatloaf, claimed it was the best this side of Columbus. He could use a little comfort food. It had been a long day, one of those endless tours of handshakes, town halls, and policy pitches. His throat was raw, his tie hung loose around his collar, and the weight of people's stories clung to him like humidity on a southern August day. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. It was warm in the way these places usually were, not just from the heat but from something lived in. Vinyl booths with a few tiers patched up by duct tape, a row of Polaroids on the back wall behind the register showing decades of birthdays, anniversaries, and regulars with their favorite waitresses. J.D. took a breath. He was ready to relax for the first time that day. Then the mood shifted. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a pause. The kind of pause that lets you know you've stepped into somewhere you don't quite belong. The young woman behind the counter, a waitress or maybe the hostess, had been halfway into a polite smile when her expression faltered. Not much, just a quick tightening of the lips, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. But J.D. had spent enough time in courtrooms and campaign stops to know when the temperature of a room dropped a few degrees. He nodded politely. Table for one. There was another pause. Longer this time. She glanced toward the swinging doors behind her, then back at him, like she was weighing her options. "One sec," she said quickly, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear before disappearing through the door to the kitchen. J.D. stood there. He could feel it now. Eyes. The kind of looks you feel in your bones before you spot them. A man in a camo ball cap, over by the window, leaned in close to the woman across from him, whispering something that made her glance J.D.'s way. Another guy, sitting at the counter with a half-eaten club sandwich, just stared outright, chewing slow like he was sizing up the moment. J.D. turned slowly, scanning the room. He was familiar with stares. Sometimes they meant admiration, sometimes resentment. This felt more like judgment. He let out a quiet breath through his nose. He wasn't going to assume. Not yet. The hostess reappeared after a few moments. She wasn't smiling this time. She walked up to him and said carefully, "I'm sorry, sir. We can't seat you tonight." J.D. blinked. The kitchen closed. He kept his tone light, calm, like maybe this was just a mistake. She shook her head. "No. We're open. But we're not serving you." Her eyes flicked away quickly, toward the kitchen. Someone was watching her. Maybe she was waiting for backup. J.D. let the words settle. No anger, no quick reply, just silence. And the silence made it worse, because now the entire diner was holding its breath. Forks hovered midair. Coffee cups rested untouched on saucers. Someone's kid even stopped fidgeting with the toy car on the table. "I see," J.D. said after a long pause. "Could I speak to the manager?" That earned him a few side glances. The older man at the counter gave a grunt. Whether of approval or annoyance, J.D. couldn't tell. The hostess didn't argue. She nodded once and disappeared into the kitchen again. This was the kind of moment J.D. Vance had lived through before. Town halls where people yelled for he could get a word out. Television interviews designed to make him stumble. But there was something different about this. This was supposed to be dinner. A quiet booth in a place that smelled like his grandmother's kitchen. The kitchen door swung open again, and out came a man who had the look of someone who'd been running this place since the Reagan administration. Heavyset, broad-shouldered, and wearing an apron that had seen better days. His name tag was crooked but legible, Don. Don stopped in front of J.D. without offering a handshake. His arms crossed over his chest, thick forearms stained with what might have been flour or old grease. "I hear you got a question," Don said, not unkind, but not inviting either. JD gave a slow nod. Yeah, I'd like to know why you're not serving me. Don exhaled through his nose, like he'd been holding that breath since JD walked in. He shifted on his feet, eyes darting briefly to the customers behind him. Some had returned to their food. Others were still watching like they were waiting to see who'd throw the first punch. It's not personal, Don said. But his tone told a different story. Folks here, they got opinions, and I got a business to run. JD tilted his head. And me sitting down for a plate of meatloaf is going to hurt business. Don rubbed at the back of his neck, grimacing. It could. Some folks don't trust you. Some don't like what you stand for. I'm not looking to start trouble. JD looked around again. He caught the older man's eye at the counter. The guy gave him a half nod, barely perceptible. Across the room, a younger man in a ball leaned back in his booth, arms crossed, watching with a grin like he was waiting for a fight. You're saying if I stay, things might get ugly, JD said, not asking but stating it plain. Don didn't respond at first. Then he said quietly, I just want to avoid a scene. JD could have walked out then. Could have called a reporter, made it tomorrow's headline. He could have made a phone call to his staff and let them spin the story. But he didn't. He looked at Don, steady and even. Then let's not make it a scene, he said. Let's talk. For a second, Don just stood there, blinking. You could tell he hadn't expected that response. Maybe he'd braced himself for an argument. Maybe a dramatic exit followed by the slam of the door and some angry post online. What he probably wasn't ready for was JD pulling out a chair, sliding it back with a slow scrape against the worn tile, and sitting down like he had nowhere else in the world to be. JD rested his hands flat on the table, palms open. He looked at Don steady, waiting. Push, not grandstanding, just waiting. You said folks don't trust me, JD said. That they don't like what I stand for. His voice was calm, even. Fine. Tell me what that means. I'm here, I'm listening. The diner was still. Even the coffee pot behind the counter seemed to stop percolating. Don shifted his weight, the leather of his work boots, creaking faintly as he glanced around the room. There was no hiding from this now. They were all watching, waiting for him to make a call. Don let out a slow breath, then walked over and took the chair opposite JD. He didn't sit all the way back. Just perched on the edge, arms resting on the tabletop, hands clasped like he was holding something together. JD could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered. Over JD's face, then over to the booths, to the counter, back to the kitchen door, and then back again. I run a place that depends on trust, Don said finally. These folks come here after their shifts are over. They scrape together what they got for a meal that feels familiar. Some of them have been coming here longer than I've owned the place. They talk. And lately, they've been talking about you, JD nodded. He'd figured as much. And what are they saying? That you're not who you say you are, Don said bluntly. That you've forgotten where you came from. That you used to be one of us, but now you're just another suit saying the things you think we want to hear. JD didn't flinch. He let Don talk. Don rubbed his hands together. They see you on TV. They hear you talk about hillbilly values and working class pride. But then they watch you walk into rooms with people who never gave a damn about towns like this until they needed a story to sell. JD leaned forward slightly, his hands still open on the table. And what do you think? Don snorted softly. Doesn't really matter what I think. It does to me. Don's eyes narrowed, studying him for a long moment. I think you're trying to straddle two worlds. The one you came from and the one you climbed into. And I think you're fooling yourself if you think you can stand in both without slipping. There was a murmur from the booth near the window, a low grunt of agreement. JD heard it but didn't break eye contact with Don. You're probably right, JD said. But I don't think I have much of a choice. I've seen both sides. I know what it's like to grow up with nothing. I also know what it's like to have a seat at the table where decisions get made. If I walk away from that, who's left to speak up for people like us? Don shook his head. People like us. You got security details and book deals now. You've been out of this world for a long time. JD smiled faintly, tired but genuine. I've got a mother who's been clean for 6 years, and every time I call, she asks me if I've been back to church. I've got cousins who still work on the line at the plant and wonder if they'll get laid off this time around. And I've got friends who never left these towns who tell me the same stories I grew up hearing. I haven't forgotten any of them. Don watched him, skeptical, but listening. The younger guy in the booth, the one who'd had his arms crossed like he was waiting for a fight, was leaning in now, not relaxed, not convinced, but curious. "You could have walked out," Don said after a while. "Could have made a mess of this. Hell, you could have called the media. Had this place crawling with reporters by morning." JD shrugged. "Why? To prove I was right. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" JD's gaze flicked toward the window, out into the dark parking lot. For a moment, he was quiet. Then he said, "Because a guy told me you had the best meatloaf in town, and I wanted to try it." Don barked a laugh. Short, sharp, unexpected. Then he sobered again. "You think sitting here talking is going to fix how folks feel about you?" "No," JD admitted, "but I'm not going to walk away from a conversation just because it's hard." The old man at the counter, the one in the frayed work jacket, set down his coffee cup with a faint clink. "That's the problem these days," he said without looking up. "Too many people walking away." Silence stretched again. Mary, the waitress, stood by the counter, holding a coffee pot in one hand, like she'd forgotten she was supposed to be pouring. Her gaze was steady on Don, waiting for his call. JD exhaled slowly, letting the quiet settle. Then, he said, "I didn't come here to make a scene. I didn't come here to score points. I came here because I was hungry and tired, and because places like this mean something to me. Whether you believe that or not, well, that's up to you." Don rubbed at his jaw, thinking. He looked over his shoulder at the kitchen door, where the cook stood half hidden, watching. Then he looked at Mary, who gave the smallest shrug like she was leaving it in his hands. Finally, Don pushed back from the table. "You ever had our meatloaf?" "Not yet." Don nodded once, like he'd made a decision. He said, "Get this man a menu." Mary hesitated for half a heartbeat, then grabbed one from under the counter. She walked it over, set it down in front of JD with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not welcoming, not hostile, just worry. JD nodded his thanks and flipped it open, pretending to study the options. He already knew what he wanted. Don lingered for another moment before heading back toward the kitchen. As he passed the counter, the old man gave him a look. Not approval exactly, but something close. The young guy in the booth shook his head, like he still didn't quite buy it, but he wasn't smirking anymore. And JD sat there, the menu open in front of him, waiting to see what happened next. JD glanced around the diner while Mary scribbled his order on her pad. The place had started to thaw, just a little. The hum of quiet conversations returned. Forks scraped against plates again, and the tension that had coiled tight around the room slowly unwound, like someone had cracked a window and let in fresh air. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it wasn't cold anymore either. He folded the menu and set it at the edge of the table. Mary took it without a word and left him alone with his thoughts. For a long moment, JD simply sat there, hands resting on the table, eyes tracing the cracked vinyl of the booth across from him. It was familiar in a way that scraped at something old inside him. This could have been any diner from his childhood. It could have been a place Mama dragged him into on a Saturday afternoon after yelling at him for mouthing off. She'd have sat him down, ordered black coffee for herself and fries for him, and told him to get his head out of his rear if he ever wanted to be something. The memory pressed against him, sharp and bittersweet. He almost smiled. From the kitchen came the sound of something sizzling, the grill heating up, the rhythm of spatulas against steel. Normal things. JD watched Don move back there, calling out something to the cooks. They answered, and it wasn't just business this time. There was a faint laugh in there. Something easing. The old man at the counter. He still hadn't given his name, turned a little on his stool. His face was carved with years JD couldn't begin to measure, but his eyes were sharper than they had any right to be. He studied JD for a few seconds before speaking. "You remember where you came from?" the man asked, his voice low but clear enough for the people nearby to hear. JD didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if the man wanted an answer, or if he was just poking at him to see if he flinched. "I do," JD said finally. "Every day." The man grunted. like he wasn't impressed but wasn't calling him a liar either. He picked up his coffee and drank. The younger guy at the booth across from JD shook his head again, like he still wasn't sure why they were even bothering. But his arms weren't crossed anymore. He was sitting forward, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around a sweating glass of iced tea, quiet but watching. Mary returned a few minutes later with a fresh cup of coffee for JD. She didn't ask if he wanted it. She just set it down in front of him and filled it halfway before leaving again. JD took a sip, the bitter heat cutting through his fatigue. He'd needed that more than he realized. When his plate finally came, it was Don who brought it. He set it down with a clatter that wasn't quite gentle but wasn't hostile either. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, Don said, tapping each item with a blunt finger like he was confirming its presence. Gravy on the side. JD nodded his thanks. Looks great. Don snorted. We'll see. Then he slid into the seat across from JD without being asked. His forearms rested on the table, hands clasped again. JD picked up his fork and took a bite. It was good, not life-changing, not fancy, just good. The kind of meal that filled you up and stuck to your ribs. He chewed, swallowed, then took another bite without saying anything. Across from him, Don studied him like a man sizing up whether or not a fence post would hold in the next storm. You always like this? Don asked after a while. JD raised an eyebrow. Like what? Patient. JD smiled faintly. Depends on who you ask. Don grunted at that. People expect you to lose your cool. Yell. Make a scene, a JD shrug. And if I did, I wouldn't be any different than they think I am. Fair. They sat like that for a while, JD eating slowly, Don watching. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't tense anymore. It was just two men sitting at a table, neither quite sure what came next but not rushing to fill the silence. The bell over the door jingled, and a woman with two kids walked in. They took a booth by the window, and Mary went to take their order like it was any normal night. JD watched them settle in, the kids squabbling over a crayon normal. After JD finished his last bite, he set his fork down and wiped his mouth with the thin napkin. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, then looked at Don. Was it the politics? JD asked quietly. Or just the fact that I walked through the door? Don didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward the booths, then back to JD. Both, Don said finally. This place, it's not about sides, it's about familiarity. Regular folks, regular problems. When someone like you shows up, it stirs everything up. JD nodded like he understood, because he did. I didn't come here to stir things up, JD said. But you did, Don pointed out. JD smiled faintly. Yeah, I did. Don sighed. It was a tired sound, like a man who'd spent the whole day hauling something heavy. You can't be one of us anymore. I know. You can't make people trust you just because you say the right thing. I know. Don leaned back in his seat. But you came anyway. JD nodded. Yeah, and that, for whatever reason, seemed to settle something for Don. He didn't smile, not really, but his face eased just a little, and he tapped the table with two fingers. You want? Don asked. Peas fresh. JD chuckled, a warm, tired sound. What couple? Sure. Why not? Don stood walking back to the kitchen. JD watched him go, then glanced over to where the old man at the counter had gone back to his coffee. The guy didn't say anything this time. He just gave JD a nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't approval. But it was something. When Don brought the pie out, Mary followed with another coffee refill. JD ate slowly, watching the room go about its business. The younger guy in the booth finally stood up, dropping some bills on the table and heading for the door. As he passed JD's table, he slowed just enough to speak. You ever do right by us? He said, not looking directly at JD. I'll be the first to say it, Bod. JD nodded. That's fair. And then he was gone, the bell jingling after him. JD finished his pie, drank his coffee, and paid his check without a word. Dunn didn't try to stop him from leaving, and Mary handed him his change with a quiet nod. As JD stepped outside into the night, the cold air hit his face, and he stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking up at the diner's flickering neon sign. It wasn't much to look at, but it meant something. Places like this always did. He got in his truck, started the engine, and sat there for a while, headlights illuminating the empty stretch of road ahead. He didn't know if any of it had made a difference. He didn't know if anyone inside would talk about it tomorrow, or if it would just fade like so many things do. But he knew he'd been honest. He'd shown up. He hadn't walked away. And for tonight, that was enough. The road stretched out in front of him like a dark ribbon, headlights carving through the night as JD drove away from the diner. The hum of the tires on the old pavement was a steady rhythm, matching the slow, deliberate beat of his thoughts. He rolled down the window a few inches, letting the cool night air cut through the cabin. It cleared his head, helped him breathe a little easier. His phone buzzed on the console, lighting up with messages he already knew he wasn't going to answer tonight. Not yet. He was in no hurry to step back into the noise. Politics would still be there tomorrow. The interviews, the handshakes, the debates where everyone had already made up their minds. That could all wait. Right now, he just needed quiet. He needed to remember what it felt like to be a man before he was anything else. The miles slipped by, town after town giving way to open stretches of fields and forests. JD kept driving. There was something about the Midwest at night, something about the way the land just rolled out endlessly, simple and unpretentious. No angles to it. No sides. Just space. Maybe that was why he always came back here, even when the rest of the world kept trying to pull him away. Eventually, he pulled over on a dirt road that cut through an old farm field, killed the engine and sat there, letting the silence press in around him. He stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel, and leaned against the hood of his truck. Above him, the stars stretched out in that cold, endless sky, sharp and clear. He could hear crickets, the faint rustle of wind in the trees. And under it all, his own heartbeat slowing. This was the part nobody ever saw. The part that never made it into the headlines or the debates. It was just a man in the dark, trying to hold on to the pieces of himself that still made sense. He stayed there for a while, thinking about everything that had happened at the diner. About Don and Mary. About the old man at the counter and the young guy in the booth who'd wanted a fight but left quiet. He wondered if they'd talk about it tomorrow, if they'd change their minds. He wasn't sure it mattered. What mattered was he'd listened. He hadn't turned away. He thought about his mama, about the way she used to talk about dignity, how you had to give it to yourself before anyone else would, how you never let anyone take it from you, but you didn't take it from anyone else either. He wondered what she'd say if she could see him now. Probably call him a fool for sticking around, probably tell him he did right, maybe both. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, but the car passed him by without slowing. JD watched it go until the red taillights disappeared over a rise. He climbed back into his truck and turned the key. The engine rumbled back to life, steady and familiar. He drove on. By the time he pulled into the gravel driveway of the small motel he'd checked into earlier that afternoon, it was late. The neon vacancy sign buzzed overhead, the office window dark. He found his room, let himself in, and stood there in the quiet for a moment before flipping the light switch. The room was simple. 2 twin beds, a wooden desk, a worn armchair, a TV that probably hadn't been replaced since the 90s. JD tossed his bag onto the bed and sat down heavily in the chair, pulled off his boots, then his jacket, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. His phone buzzed again. This time, he picked it up. A text from one of his aides. "Call me in the morning. We need to talk about what happened." JD sighed. Set the phone down on the nightstand without answering. He wasn't ready to dissect it. Not yet. He thought about that last bite of pie. About the laugh Don let slip when JD joked about the burger. He thought about the old man and his factory job, about the way his voice had softened when he admitted JD was the only one who stuck around to listen. Maybe that was the only thing he'd ever get out of nights like this. But it was enough. For now, he stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. The parking lot was mostly empty. His truck sat alone under the buzzing light pole, casting long shadows across the pavement. Across the road, a gas station was closing up for the night. The clerk flipped the sign to see Alice had locked the door and walked away. He let the curtain fall shut again. In the morning, he'd hit the road early. He had more towns to visit, more conversations to have. Most of them wouldn't be easy. Some of them would end the way this one started, with cold shoulders and long silences. But he'd show up, because that's what he'd promised himself a long time ago. That no matter how far he got from where he started, He'd show up, and maybe that was the real work. Not the speeches or the debates, not the votes or the campaigns, but the showing up, sitting in rooms where people didn't want you, listening until they knew you were there for them and not for yourself. He lay down on the bed, stared at the ceiling. The hum of the heater filled the room, soft and steady. Sleep didn't come right away, but when it did, it was deep. When JD woke the next morning, the sun was just starting to rise, pale orange light creeping through the gap in the curtains. He took a quick shower, dressed, and packed his bag. Before he left, he scribbled a note and left it on the nightstand, just 2 words. Thank you. He wasn't sure who it was for, maybe himself. He drove out of Springfield before most of the town was awake. The diner's neon sign was still on when he passed by, flickering quietly in the morning fog. He thought about stopping again, just to see, but he didn't. He kept driving. The radio was off. He liked the silence better, and as he moved down the highway, the sky opening wide above him, he let himself believe something he hadn't believed in a long time. That maybe people could change. That maybe conversations mattered, and maybe, just maybe, the next diner would be different. He was counting on it.